Hello, I'm Max Steyer, President and CEO of the Partnership for Public Service. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to a better government and a stronger democracy. Our view is we have one tool for collective action to deal with our biggest problems as a society that has the imprimatur of the public and taxpayer resources behind it, and that's the United States government. All eyes right now in this world are obviously on the election, and we are very much of the view that we also need to be thinking about whoever wins, making sure that they are ready to govern on day one. And there is no more important rationale for that than keeping us safe, the most fundamental function of our government. In order to do that, that requires extensive and thoughtful transition planning. And in addition to the Service to America medals, the Oscars of Government Service, the Best Places to Work rankings, a lot of leadership training, efforts to bring talent into government at the entry level, and working on trust in government. Partnership for Public Service also runs the Center for Presidential Transition. And that is our effort now, 16 years old, to help campaigns understand what they need to do to be ready to govern on day one if their candidate wins. And that includes not only challengers, but also incumbents. So a new area that we're very much focused on is making sure that incumbents that have historically not paid attention to transition planning, that they actually do it, and that they have real opportunities for improving performance in the second term, just as challengers do for making sure that they're ready in the first term. So with that, I want to make sure we have a great panel, extraordinary panel, and I'm looking forward to hearing from them. We also have a wonderful audience, and in that audience, I want to particularly highlight two of our board members. So we have Les Lyles and Scott Gould, two exceptional public servants themselves. Thank you for not only your public service in the government, but also your public service on our board, as your voices are making us much, much better. It's also my pleasure to introduce now the head director of our Center for Presidential Transition, and that is Valerie Boyd. Again, a longtime public servant and someone who is doing an exceptional job leading our center to help candidates and incumbents make sure they're ready to govern on day one. All yours, Valerie.
Thank you, Max. I'm honored to be here with four outstanding leaders hailing from different areas in the national security space. I can think of no better people to help us examine continuity across administrations and help us understand why the period between election and inauguration has always been a fraught time for national security and how we have good practices in place to address it. It's a period during which political leaders come and go, and any gap in information sharing can risk preparedness. And as Max said, this is true regardless of whether we're looking at a second term of an incumbent or a new leader, because there are a number of personnel changes at stake. So, because the four of you have experience across multiple administrations, we're fortunate to hear from you about the ongoing practices for career and political leaders to work together across agencies to address security concerns. I will take a moment to remind our audience now that there is a chat function to enter questions. We'll save some time at the end of this conversation to address your questions live. So I'm going to introduce our four guests with the very briefest career highlights, appreciating that there's a lot more to say to each of you. But my first question will be about asking you to share something about yourselves. So we're fortunate to be joined by Elaine Duke, the former Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, Acting Secretary of Homeland Security, and confirmed Undersecretary for Management. She has been in the federal government for nearly three decades. We're joined by Essie Miller, who is the retired Deputy Chief Information Officer for the Department of Defense, who retired from DoD in 2020 after 35 years of service in the Air Force, Army, and Office of Secretary of Defense. We're also pleased to have Karen Gibson, the current Sergeant at Arms of the United States Senate. Karen became the Sergeant of Arms in March 2021 after completing a 33-year military career, attaining the rank of Lieutenant General in the United States Army. She's also served as Deputy Director of National Intelligence and U.S. Central Command and U.S. Army Cyber Command. Finally, we're very lucky to have Sue Gordon, the former Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence. Sue joined the CIA in 1980 and served for 29 years there, and has served as Deputy Director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency from 2015 to 2017. So I gave some recent highlights from your careers, but it's always fun for us to start a conversation with distinguished public servants by asking you what got you interested in government service in the first place. Can we do a quick lightning round with each of you on the short story of how you entered public service? Whoever wants to go first.
All right, I'll start out. So I'm going to start out with honesty. I actually came for the practical and then stayed for the passion and opportunity. I'm at the end of the baby boomer generation, and security is important to us. And also the job market was tight. Sue, you were around that time too, when I finished undergrad, and coming to a good job offer was hard to come by, especially since it was a GS7 and it came with a $17,000 a year salary. What could beat that? After coming for those reasons, I immediately knew this is where I was going to stay. The amount of responsibility, the ability to make a difference, and the endless growth personally and continually, and the meaningful work, becoming a public servant, there is nothing like it in the world.
Well, I'll follow since we're the same generation. Although I started as a GS7 and I made $13,000 a year. So we've just discovered I'm a little older. I believe we are who we began as. I was the third child of a naval officer. So public service was kind of what we were taught, and that's do your best and do something for the cause. When I was finishing undergraduate, I couldn't decide if I wanted to get my PhD or go to law school. I thought, well, that's too big a range. So why don't you get a job? And the CIA was recruiting on campus, and I thought that sounded like something I'd be interested in. And so I was hired, and it was like peas and carrots, a lot like you said, where for me, it was a great place for a fundamentally curious person to land. But more importantly, the responsibility that you get to carry early and the chance to make a difference was really impactful. And so I stayed, never bored a day. Interestingly enough, I left for 8 years to spend some time with my family. So I had a chance to make another choice about what I did kind of halfway through. And I chose to come back into public service because I just was addicted to making a difference.
I feel so cheated. I started as a GS5. I missed the mark somewhere. But very similar for me. I was finishing up my undergrad, prepared to go and pursue my MBA, and at the last minute decided I didn't want to go to school. So I hopped in that job market as well, and the Air Force was hiring interns because of the math and computer programming classes I had. They picked me up right away. But ironically, what's the first thing they did? Send me back to school. But 35 years looking back, I wouldn't have changed a thing.
So like Sue, I come from a family with a deep legacy of service, whether those are veterans, public servants, or folks like my mom. She was a stay-at-home mother, but always deeply engaged in our community. And it was instilled in us that the tremendous great fortune we had to be born in the United States, but that we owed something back and needed to contribute to society, and that the collective contributions of our citizens is really the strength of the nation. I was also taught that you don't get to complain about something unless you are willing to do what you can to try to address it. And government service is a tremendous way to get at many of our thorniest problems. I joined the Army because they had paid for my college tuition at Purdue University. I owed them 4 years, and here I am 37 years in the government, and it's really all I've done. I found that I was very inspired, as are my co-panelists, by the challenges and tough problems that we take on. I'd say, there's no lack of those in the government, but I think really more than anything, I firmly just absolutely love being part of a team of dedicated men and women who are committed to working together to make a difference.
So now I just want to talk about the four of you, but I'm going to try to keep myself on task and fast forward a bit to your recent roles leading agencies. And I want to talk about that time as a new administration is coming in or a new term is starting. And maybe let's start with Sue and Karen. As you took your most recent roles, what security events took the world by surprise? And what, if anything, made it difficult for your agencies to respond?
So Karen, I'll start and you can fix it. It's kind of been our career. So first thing, I just kind of need to give what I think is the best part of our system, and that is we have political appointees who come in carrying the policies that are essentially, because of our system, the will of the people. That's the what are we going to try and do. And then you have the careerists who, through their expertise and their experiences, kind of carry the how. Well, this is what you want to do and how you do it. And so it's a really magical coming together when it works well, but you have to create the opportunity for that conversation to happen, and you can't be dogmatic on either side. And I think that is what the whole of transition is getting that impedance mismatch to come together. So I served in the Trump administration. I came in a little after the beginning, so the transition had happened in part because it took a while to get all the appointees confirmed. There was nothing but security events. I think one of the things that, so we started out with President-elect Trump wanting to take a call from the president of Taiwan, and should that happen, and can that happen, and how do you even talk about it, and when it was different from what we expected to do. So how do you share the wisdom that the institution has about how you would go about making that conversation happen, and the interest of the president-elect in effecting his policy differently from perhaps how previous members had. So it starts at that very fundamental level of intention and ability, and then putting them together. We moved very quickly into conversations with Russia, and then North Korea rattling its sword. And so there was no time to really just go through an education process. You, of course, have those, but what you're doing at the beginning, even though there's a lot of formulaic aspects of it, is you're trying to establish a relationship so the incoming administration understands the foundation, understands how the system works so they can command it, and understands how they engage it to get the information they need. And so in national security, as practiced by the intelligence community, there's always a crisis. And the efforts from day one were to provide a foundation and then provide the linkages so that we can engage as policy wanted to be effective. Karen?
I think that's a great answer, especially on the linkages, the relationships, and the foundation. When I came to this role as the Senate Sergeant at Arms, the event that took the world by surprise had been the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And I was approached in February of 21 about taking this position to replace the gentleman that left on January 7th. I was not here for the immediate response, obviously, but was dealing with the aftermath and the rebuilding of the security institutions at the Capitol, since they'd made a clean slate of House, Senate, Sergeant at Arms, Chief of Police, everyone was gone. There's often a big focus, I think, in transitions on the information that folks will need, line and block charts, authorities, budgets, this is the calendar coming up, and that is all really important. But to say it's, drinking from a fire hose is an understatement. And every job I've had, I think I've discovered a binder, a year or 18 months into the position of information that was handed to me that I either never got around to reading or, skimmed and didn't absorb and thought, gosh, I wish I'd known that. But I think even if you're handed all the information on a platter, the toughest part is cohering as a team to deal with the crisis. And in my military experience, when you have it's called a TOA, or a transfer of authority downrange, where one unit comes in and another comes out, that seam between organizations is the most vulnerable time on a battlefield. And I think it's probably very true for agencies or administrations as well, because you haven't had the opportunity to settle, to gel, to perfect, or perhaps even practice how you're going to respond in a crisis. And so I think sometimes it's less about actually getting the information that you need, because even if it's an administration or a leadership team that's been there for some time, something's going to come from left field that you weren't expecting. But as Sue says, having those linkages and relationships, a crisis is not a time to start swapping business cards. And so understanding how you're going to respond as a team, who will take what roles, what kinds of tasks you will stop doing while you deal with the crisis. I really think that's the trickiest part of a change, a transfer of authority, and perhaps sometimes too much emphasis played on the transfer of information and less about thinking about how the team is going to respond.
So as somebody who has put together transition briefing books for new teams and then seen them sit on a shelf for the next year or two or three, I can empathize with the point about information sharing and your point about how teams need to cohere before an emergency strikes is a really good segue to the next thing I wanted to ask about. Elaine, I know you've seen new teams coming together at the beginning of multiple new administrations. What have you seen work well to get a new team to cohere?
I think that to get a new team to cohere, it's exactly what we just heard from Karen and Sue, is we're in a position to do two things: create those linkages, as Karen called them, but also inform the new appointees about their operational roles. And I think that's the hardest. A lot of new appointees come in knowing their area. You know, if you might be a medical or public health specialist coming into HHS, but you don't know the role of, for instance, HHS in North Korea launching a missile and our missile defense system not being able to stop it. And that's the part that I think we as the feds can help with. And that's what's most important to our country, is a coordinated incident response. And I've seen it work well, and I've seen it work not well. I would say, for me, one of the biggest surprises was not what was happening to the country. It was what was happening to me. I became acting secretary. Surprise, surprise. And on day one of being acting secretary, the president wanted to have a meeting about pulling out of Afghanistan immediately. And I would say, first of all, the network. Sue Gordon, I have to shout out to you at those times. And Claire Grady, I know you're on the line. You know, people around you that can bolster you in those positions, but how the cabinet worked together, putting country first, but bringing in the independent needs of each agency to form the best response, not the optimized response for a specific agency. Excuse me, not the maximized response, but the optimized response for our country. I contrast that to maybe our COVID response, where it appeared that the White House is trying to run an incident without coordination, without the cabinet maybe being in a coordinated role. And I think that's a challenge for all of you that are still in service, is if the cabinet is not running effectively, it's upon the agencies to bring that coordination together. So if you don't have a strong principals committee or deputies committee, for whatever reason, it's on you to bring that unified incident response and that coordination together. And that's probably the number one role, aside from all those great briefing books, Valerie.
You know, can I just jump in real quick, pick up on something you said? I think it was so important, and that is, you know, when a leader comes in as part of an administration, they have two responsibilities. One is to the administration, and one is to affect the responsibility they carry, right? It's they have to bring that role to the administration, and they have to play it honestly, not obstreperously, not to try and shape policy as much, but to effect that role and to bring it so that there's this glorious tension between the outcome you want and the best way to get there. And understanding both is really the magic that a leader can bring. It's not always enough to want an outcome. We all want that shared outcome for America, but you do have to get that outcome using the best of what each organization has. And so you do have to understand not only the information, but the responsibility that you are sitting on top of when you have that leadership position. So I love that you brought that up, Elaine.
Yeah. I think at the heart of that is remembering we have a force in place who's responsible for continuity of government. And to Elaine's point, we've got a career force that's in place that has done this, that has made it happen. And we've got to establish that level of trust between the two very early on. You know, for me, when I became acting CIO, my direction was don't act, do. And that meant using the network and the relationships I had in place to affect the mission and the objectives that Sue's talking about. So you've got a whole ecosystem there that comes into play that we need to keep in mind as we're doing this.
I love how you're giving both national security tips and leadership tips, like how to think about your roles in agencies. Karen, did I interrupt you?
No, not at all. I would just offer, when I think about cohering a new team, and I've not worked at the White House or at the cabinet level, but certainly have been part of many other teams that were sometimes multinational teams that are brought together on short notice that haven't worked together before. I think two of the impediments, not to be negative, but two of the chief impediments sometimes to cohering a team are sometimes personalities, and another are institutional equities. And I think a leader sets a tone at the top in terms of collaboration and teamwork. And you probably have a collection of people working for you, some of whom you get to pick and some of whom you don't. And when you are selecting people, I would hope that those values of teamwork and collaboration and a willingness to think broadly and not parochially are among the attributes that a leader is looking for and valuing when they bring their team together, that they're ones that they're reinforcing, and that they are doing their best to nip in the bud those who choose not to share or collaborate because they think knowledge is power. I used to tell folks on my team, just because the guy on your left or right or gal doesn't look good, looks bad, doesn't mean you look good, that I expected them to all work together and support each other. But I think, Sue was kind of hinting on the things that the different agencies or entities will bring to a problem. It's important to understand the institutional equities of people who are at the table because they are representing an institution or an agency which has, and I don't mean it in a negative way, but an agenda of its own sometimes, or things that are important to that institution or agency that may be at odds with a potential policy direction. And so understanding that. And I'd close by saying one of my best bosses, a terrific mentor of mine, he used to say, at the end of the day, we have to step back and think, not what's best for me, not what's best for my team or my agency, but what's best for the nation. And I think, again, the leader setting that tone at the top is very important.
Several of you have alluded to these sort of dual or triple sets of responsibilities to your agency, the mission, and what to do, particularly if there's a challenge with coordination across agencies. So I wonder, and I know this is a little delicate, do any of you have advice for a new White House team about how to encourage cooperation across agencies? And create a leadership team sort of across them?
I think it's harder for a new White House team because they come in with a mindset of paranoia in today's politics, if you will. I think this is an area where we can shine as the public servants of our country, and we can take the first step to building that trust. I think there's a couple things I would say about that. One is, like I said, we have to build the trust. You know, when you look at the senior executive service, executive core qualifications, it's no surprise that one of them, and I think the most important one, is building coalitions. And that includes political savvy, influencing, and negotiating as the skills. So let's use those, and let's be the ones that kind of reach out with the flag. And I think that's important. I also think that in the transition, answer not only their questions, but start working with them on what else they need to know. And I think that's really important. It's important to answer their questions. It's important to deliver all the deliverables on time, but it's also important to say, hey, did you think about this? And helping inform them as they move forward. And so I think those are a couple things that we can do to move forward. I also think, and that's in the operational areas, in the policy roles. And the third thing I'd say is using the brand new appointees that are not Senate confirmed, that are there from day one, because they're the ones that are going to do the norming and storming, and there's more of them than political appointees. So let's, you know, start with not the highest ranking person, but the one that kind of comes on first and maybe is in the most influential person, and start building that on day one, I think is important. If you wait for, you know, your secretary, it's going to be too late. It's building at the Schedule C level, I think is the most important.
No, and when I remember why I was so delighted to serve with you, just listening to you talk. So this is a fun day for me, and to see actually everyone on the screen. But you remind me of Valerie, you talked about how you build the team. I also think there's a mindset you have to bring, and I put a lot of pressure on the institution, in part because that's what I represented for so many years, even though I became a political appointee. Don't be so dogmatic with the new appointees. You know, think about the knowledge you have, and make sure that your command is so good that you can play with it, not just represent how it was done, not just that we used to walk uphill in the snow both ways, but really try and listen to what's trying to be achieved. You're not giving up anything, but again, you're trying to create good collective outcome. You have an important piece of it. And so, you know, kind of to every member of the team, and consequently the leaders of the two protagonists here, think about what you possess, not dogmatically, but usefully, and how you can share that, and not think that the other side is dumb because they are not you. And I think this is where the institutions have real opportunity to make those first days really productive, is to listen to what's trying to be accomplished and share what you know, not how you've done it in the past.
You know, that's a really good point. If I could give an example, Sue, at the start of the Trump administration, of how the bureaucracy enabled and partnered. So we knew, or DHS knew, that a wall was going to be built, a fence along the border. Customs and Border Protection came together with their best to make sure that with that policy decision, whether you agree with it or not, that the wall was going to be built most effectively and most efficiently. And CBP delivered their best to ensure that. So it's not about the policy decision. It was about how do you use the bureaucracy to enable that to be most effective for our country. And that was a beautiful example of that working, which I think is what you just talked about.
Yeah, I love how you're all talking about investing in the strength of institutions and making these connections across career expertise and political priorities. So somewhat relatedly, something that we talk about at the partnership a lot is the challenge of vacancies across high priority positions. Senate confirmation of political appointees is taking an astounding average of 172 days. We're curious about whether there are prolonged vacancies that place a significant burden on acting officials in the national security space. So Essie, I have a lot of questions for you about coming up about long-term technology investments and continuity. But I haven't asked you a question in a while. I wonder if would you want to address this question about vacancies in national security positions and how they might affect planning or coordination?
Well, that transition obviously impacts an organization because there's a level of tension and anxiety that goes along with that process for your career folks. But I encourage people to look at it differently. Every organization has strategic objectives and things that they're already working on. And if those are enduring targets, it doesn't change, particularly from a technology aspect. Sue will laugh, during this last transition we were in together, the big cloud discussion was at the heart of everything. And industries pulling at us from every direction. It didn't matter to me that we were in a transition. The question was, how do we make sure we execute given the directions, the priorities, the resources that we had in place while maintaining the organization in a steady state? As you can't, I don't think we can lose sight of people will be anxious in the process no matter what. And they want to know that they'll be taken care of. And in some instances that they'll have a job, speaking from the governance piece. The key is to stay focused and to communicate. And I said it earlier, I was told not to act, to go do. So it meant I wasn't there to fill the plug. I was there to keep the organization moving forward toward the big things that we had to do. And a lot of that, Valerie, goes back to what I said earlier about trust and respect and understanding what everybody brings to the table. Sort of to Karen's point, you don't want to call them agendas, but everybody has something that they're trying to accomplish. And we just need to take time to understand what that is. Because 9 times out of 10, we're all going in the same direction. It's just a question of how we get there.
So I love that, Essie, because I think that's one of the things a leader can do the most is eyes in the boat. There are many more similarities than there are differences. There is tremendous strength in our systems and our institutions. And my experience is the women and men who make a career of it, they are motivated to do the right thing for Mr. and Mrs. America
Right.
every day. And so, yeah, there can always be worry. I think that's gotten more difficult and more front of mind over the last 15 years. But by and large, do what you've been doing. It's going to keep us, one, straight and level flight, but two, it is going to be 87% in the direction that the new policy is going to go to.
Right.
And so I think leaders can reinforce that we know what we're doing. Let's do it. Let's do it aggressively and be ready for the shifts that are going to come over time, but not wait in paralysis. I think that's a lovely message, Essie. And you did effect that brilliantly when you were in your place.
And I think don't wait is the most important thing I heard out of both of you. And I think that even if your top leadership is waiting for Senate confirmation, they're around, they're just hidden so that it doesn't make it harder for them to get confirmed. And so working with the people you have to execute and find that bond. One example I have is I was a Bush holdover into the Obama administration about 18 months. And I was the only holdover at DHS headquarters. And I was given a chief of staff, Chris Kaminsky, who I think is also on the call. But we bonded over a common goal of doing good in Homeland Security. And we each had a piece of it. He had the access to information, and I was a little cut out naturally till I was able to gain that trust. And I had the whole bureaucracy that could deliver results. And we immediately bonded those two pieces of the same solution, and it worked extremely effectively. Chris was a Schedule C, but he was on there in day one. He was on the inner circle of the team, and he was an effective, he was a good leader and effective for me to partner with from day one and keep DHS moving forward.
So, and Valerie, I noticed in the chat, Keith is asking about the value of formers during that transition role. And I have to do a shout out. There were former CIOs and former other government officials that I reached out to as I rolled into that acting position to make sure I had a broader picture of what was going on and that I wasn't missing anything.
Right.
So yeah, those formers, gray beards, whatever we're calling them these days, are very valuable because you won't know it all going into the role day one.
I agree, Essie. I would say I supported the last presidential transition. I was on an agency review team. And if you recall, in 2020, we were waiting for approval from the General Services Administration. A lot of folks didn't know until then that they had a role in presidential election, but we were waiting to hear from them before we could enter the agencies. And in that time that we were waiting, we leaned forward and conducted interviews with as many formers as we could to start to build that knowledge for the new administration coming in while we waited permission or approval to enter and speak with the current officials.
You're demonstrating exactly why we wanted to talk to all of you, because you're showing the importance of working together across challenging circumstances and investing in the institutions. And I think it's important for people to hear from all of you, because it feels like we're in a particularly vulnerable moment with polarization and low trust in government, numerous international challenges. So can I ask you, what are some of the areas you're most concerned about, kind of maintaining continuity if there's a transition to a new team?
Oh, let's see. So again, I have optimism behind the strength of our system. I think there are so many good things about our system. I think there's a lot of rhetoric that you hear, but we really do work pretty well. Can we be better? Yes. Oh my, holy smokes. Each one of us, I'm looking at the faces on this screen. Each one of us, when we were in, and Karen, you still in public service, I think you would have considered all of us revolutionaries who were trying to make government better every day. But I think there's real strength here that we can rely on. But here's what I worry about. I worry that the rhetoric will cause some people to believe that they can't participate anymore, that they won't, that this isn't for them, that they can't succeed, that they won't make a difference. All the things that we said we joined to do. I think there's a little bit of a dialogue out there that says that this isn't what we have experienced. And I worry that people will make a decision before we have the chance to get into it and see that those opportunities are still there. So talent is the most important thing. I think each one of us would tell you that the reason why we're so confident is because we know the people that we have served with over so many years. And if they'll continue to come and serve, we're going to be okay. I worry about lack of trust within the system, that the incoming political appointees might, if they haven't had experience, will come in believing that there's antipathy on the other side, and both ways. And I think what we talked about in the beginning about you kind of have to come together with an open mind that we're in this for this bigger quest. If you come in with that concern and you hold back, I think we'll get there, but we'll be slower. And then the last thing I worry about, there are adversaries and competitors who will use moments when we seem distracted to advance their agendas at the expense of ours. And so whether it is a pandemic or a weather event, or whether it is actually mischief by adversaries and competitors, when we are not functioning. And I think there's some worry that we'll be slow to get to where we need to. Those are probably my top three: talent, trust, and just focus.
I'd like to, that's true. I'd like to build on two of the terrific things that Sue just said there. One, I think it reinforces that time of transition as a time of vulnerability in terms of the ability to respond. And we often, again, it's a very military example, but would see adversaries like the Taliban take advantage of that transition of authority in a district or a province to attack, because it takes time. This is a time when people are vulnerable. So to your point, Sue, about certain adversaries potentially taking advantage of a post-election period or a new administration to seize some advantage for themselves. I think also, and this isn't really addressed that question, but it's a point I'd like to make. We've talked a lot about how the new appointees establish trust. I think we've talked about sort of interagency relationships, or at the White House and the cabinet level. And we've talked about the actings and the people within the institutional career civil servants. I don't think we could talk a little more about a new political appointee establishing that relationship of trust with the career institution people below them. And so the sooner a new appointee can show this mutual trust, respect, appreciation for the contributions of the people who do this every day, that it is not, to kind of touch on some of Sue's points of this element of painting the people within the institution as the enemy. And it becomes, you hear it in some of the very polarized rhetoric, but coming in to show that this is not the case and that they are trusted. I think that's really important, because people may be leery based on the way the tone of the election has gone, or some of the things that have been said about these people who are brought in to clean up their office.
And Karen, I would add to what you said, by right now, I know this session is more about after election, but be very aware that there will be a degree of ugliness. And what can we do to minimize that? What can we do to take ourselves and our mission programs out of the political ugliness at the extremes and make it nonpartisan? And I think that's very important to think about as you prepare written and oral materials. How the key could be in the wording. How do you pitch a program? I think of Unified Immigration Portal in DHS. That is not a partisan program, but could be very easily thought of as that. This is how we're going to let people in our country, for instance. But how do you deliver your institutional capabilities in a way that wants the incoming administration to preserve them and use them? So be very careful in your words orally and building that trust and relationships, so that we can broaden what's kept and is usable and minimize the chaos.
I almost hate to say it, but I'm going there. A discussion that we need to have is with the value of bureaucracy. We always think bureaucracy is a bad thing, but we need to understand the value and the checks and balances that come into play. You have to have left and right limits of what you can and can't do to avoid the bad and the ugly that Elaine is alluding to. But we also have a responsibility to help those new folks understand the processes and the nuggets and the value in the process, so that they can get closer to the things that they're trying to achieve.
Yep.
But if nothing else, understand we have a responsibility to the American people to deliver and to manage the resources and the capabilities that we have in such a way that they continue to trust what we do.
I think that's great, Essie. Bureaucracy has such negative connotations.
Exactly.
And it would be better if we referred to it as institutional continuity, because that's what it is.
Yeah, good.
I was thinking about you with this question, Essie, because you've overseen major investments in technology upgrades over time that are, I don't think I know the details, but I imagine you've managed programs that are 10, 20-year plans. And that feels like an element of where the knowledge of the bureaucracy is important for continuity.
It is, Valerie. I think I spent most of my time over in the EEOB, all related to technology and technology change, back to the allusion to the cloud conversation earlier. When you're balancing what you need for the mission and what private industry or corporations would have us do, you really gotta think that through. I see Sue look at me like, hey, what is she talking about?
No, I'm totally with you. And just to jump the shark a little bit on what you're saying is, we talk so much about change, the negative aspects. Essie, how many times have you used a new leader as the opportunity to do something new? There is real opportunity in change, and the institutions are also looking for those opportunities. So I just think what you're talking about is real transportation to both the value of the institutions and the opportunity of a new administration. So
And thank you for that, Sue, because it reminds me, one of the things that we did early on was to put one of our new leaders over on supporting the new federal CIO. It gave us an opportunity to help her understand how the department worked and the value of that cross-agency engagement, because we were all dealing with the same thing. And it's pretty cool because that early investment set us up really, really well when the pandemic hit. Those relationships were already in place. We knew the pivotal industry partners that we could rely on, but we also knew how we could work through, Karen, the bureaucracy of the acquisition system to get us what we needed right away. So to me, Valerie, it all comes back to relationships, trust and respect, and communication. We've got to have those key variables in this process, or it will be a fight the entire time.
So I see some great questions in the chat, but I want to take one more minute to address something that that I think is at the forefront of everybody's minds. We're about 4 months from the election, about 6 months from inauguration, and we know from our survey data that a plurality of Americans are concerned about what the next transition might look like. And we have some great expertise here to help us talk about how federal agencies, congressional entities, and state and local offices all have roles in security during this period. So Karen, could I start with you and just ask about what people should know about how agencies coordinate across branches to prepare for the inauguration and reduce security risks?
Yeah, sure. So the inauguration is an example of what we call an NSSE, a National Special Security Event. And Elaine would know these well. NSSEs are designated as such by the Secretary of Homeland Security. The State of the Union address is always an NSSE. Next week's Republican nominating convention will be an NSSE, as will the Democratic one the following month in Chicago. The Super Bowl is an NSSE. And so they come in different flavors and sizes and character, but they all have a similar framework for preparation and response. And it brings together federal and, in my case, also legislative agencies. There are a number of committees, interagency committees that work the various security related aspects of the event, to include an intelligence committee. We have a great number of, I think the one I have the most experience with is the annual State of the Union address. We always have a series of tabletops where we bring together various agencies that would have some kind of response or security role. And here in Washington, it's incredible because of, when you're on the West Front, you're Capitol Police, the street is the Metropolitan Police, the opposite curb is the Park Police, north of us is Amtrak, behind us is the Supreme Court, but you bring everyone together and you talk through how information would flow, who makes decisions where, how you might respond to various contingencies. We also put liaisons in each other's various command centers. And while the State of the Union address is not on the scale of the inauguration itself, it's still, I have found it to be a tremendously useful framework. And it really, it requires and partnership across the many agencies that are involved. And I have no doubt that that same framework, which we're already hard and trained on for the inauguration, is going to stand us in good stead for January 20th.
I think you gave a great answer to that. And I think our country is very effective at handling those events. I would also add to that the other side, and that's ensuring continuity of regular operations while this NSSC or distraction is going on. What competent people are going to be staying at home, dealing with those important and not urgent issues of our mission, so that we don't have an open aperture for our adversaries as we're focused on this point in our country. And looking at the questions, I think we'll get into this a lot more, but it's important, I think, to have both.
Yeah, Elaine, you're thinking the same thing I am, looking at the chat and seeing good questions about both our allies and our adversaries and what we need to demonstrate to them during this during a period where leaders are coming and going. I see one question about what challenges does a presidential transition present to the United States' relationships with our allies and the importance of our international standing to our national security interests. Would any of you want to address that? I see a similar question about our adversaries and what signals we should be giving them.
Well, we just hosted NATO here, right? For this, it's been a very busy week on the Hill. And I think, you know, while I was only on the periphery, as various heads of state came to the Capitol, they are all looking for assurance of the commitment and that the relationship that they have with our nation won't change or won't change significantly. And I think, you know, outside of NATO, that it is the same, that really other nations want to know that our commitment isn't going to change.
And I think actually Karen and Elaine gave the best answer to that. I know we think about the very top as being the most important aspect of our national security writ large, but the backbreaking physical labor is affected by the professionals every day. And if their leaders do what Essie had suggested and others is eyes in the boat, do that job. Some of that job is their relationships with allies and partners to be able to not only keep us doing what we're doing, but communicate so that nobody feels as though all that they know is what they're reading in the press. There is a really lovely strength to our institutions that involves having relationships that operate below the chop of policy waters. And so it's not just that the institutions are doing their jobs, but part of that job is to stay connected. And that's one of the things that is important in times of transition, so that those things are going on too. The world is watching the things we say and the disruptions and the dialogues going on, but I think there is a role for the leaders of institutions to attend to that part as well, and our partners and allies look forward to that.
I'll also put a pitch in while we see Sue on the screen of continuing to focus on intelligence-driven operations. That is not just a DoD thing. In the civilian agencies, Homeland Security, you know, we constantly work towards that. It is better, but at times like this, I think that the importance. Go ahead, Sue.
It's super important. It's super important. It is. You named it perfectly.
Essie, I was glad that you called out Heath Brown's question in the chat. Not everybody might know Heath wrote a terrific book released this year about the 2020 transition called Roadblock, which we would recommend everybody take a look at. I see one more question about advice to senior career officials who might serve in an acting or PDTDO position. I know a lot of acronyms, but I don't know that one. Can anybody help me out?
It's something along the lines of person. It's not an acting person. It's person acting in the role of that.
Performing the duties of.
Yeah.
That's it.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I think if you kind of zoom out and listen to the whole of the comments that we made when it comes to the institutions, it's kind of forget the limitations of your title and embrace the responsibility that you're carrying for your women and men and the country that's being affected through your institution, and carry that out aggressively to the best of your ability. I think one of the great misnomers is that there is concerted active resistance to new. I think any installed base is resistant, and we have to overcome that. But do your job aggressively, knowing that the things that you're doing are in the nation's best interest. Carry those out, and then be ready for new course as that appears. But you can't wait to lead, right? That's my best advice. Waiting to lead is a recipe for ineffectiveness for you and peril for us, and you don't want to be in that place. So take on the job, do it to the best of your abilities, and we'll be all right.
Don't act, do.
Yeah. Love it, Essie.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, and I love the question that just came in the chat about what it's going to take in the next decade from a talent perspective to keep the U.S. secure. Stephen is asking, we know the government is facing mass retirement of critical, deeply experienced careerists in the immediate future. This is a hard question, but who does the government need to recruit, and what's the plan?
I think we need to recruit energetic, talented, curious, as Sue says, insatiably curious, motivated, dedicated young folks who want to take a turn at making a difference. And I'd say they don't all have to make it a career. In fact, we don't want them all to make it a career. Just very briefly, in the Senate Sergeant at Arms, our motto is honoring tradition, embracing innovation. It can be a tough balance. I work in a place that still has spittoons on the floor, and you're only allowed to have milk or water on the Senate chamber. We have some deep traditions, yet we also strive to modernize. And similarly, when we hire folks here, I want a balance of people who have been here a long time and deeply understand the unique and sometimes different ways that we operate, while bringing in folks, particularly in cybersecurity and technology, who have a fresh understanding of what's needed. I think it requires to be a strong government, both new energy and ideas, as well as people who have deep understanding based on a decades-long career.
I think we have to be the leaders that people want to work for, but also, because there is an aging career population, meet the current generation where they are. They're different. And how do we grow the passion in them to want to come in? And I think you made a good point, Karen. They may not stay like some of us did, but how do we embrace that in and out, and the value of having industry experience or whatever it is? The last thing I'll say is, I think all of us that are in civil service or have been, or just think about Schedule F and what your position is on that and how that could affect this question here, and be active if you have a position. I think that's a big issue on our bureaucracy. And I think Essie and Sue both talked about the value of our bureaucracy. What did you call it? Institutional
continuity.
Institutional continuity. So what effect would Schedule F have on institutional continuity and also the balance of power that our Constitution set up?
Yep.
Which means we need to change the way we're having the conversation to help our younger folks connect the dots between their talent and service. Those two align very closely.
Yeah, Essie, we need to talk. This is a great forum. I'm hoping people walk away saying, "Holy smokes!" I know that sounds like a fun thing to do. I think when we talk about it, it's inspiring. I think what's nice is that the young people that I meet, they are people of purpose. They are seeking purpose. And that is one thing that I think we would all say, this is big purpose. It is super hard and super challenging and super rewarding. And I think if we can talk about it more, be flexible, as Karen said, about how we engage them, not make them walk uphill both ways. But I think they are exactly who we need to take us to the future. We just got to convince them to come.
That is a terrific note to end on. And we knew this conversation would be inspiring to speak to the four of you. I knew that you would barely need a moderator to have a conversation about these issues. And I appreciate so much the opportunity to bring you together and hear from you. So as we're closing, I just want to say thank you for your service. Thank you for your time this morning. Thank you for your commitment to the mission and the institutions. It's really been a pleasure to get to have this conversation with you.
It's been great.
Thanks for having us,
Thank you.
Valerie.
Absolutely.
Yeah.